My name is Lucas Bennett, and the night my father called me garbage in a suit in front of my entire family was the moment my life split into a before and after. It happened during what was supposed to be a warm, celebratory evening, his 65th birthday dinner. I had flown back home to Pittsburgh wearing the same navy blazer I'd worn when closing my biggest deal yet. I thought that night would be the perfect moment to finally tell him and the rest of my family about what I'd built, a thriving logistics software company now worth over $25 million. I'd spent years quietly sending money when they needed it, paying for my sister's down payment, covering my mother's hospital bills, even bailing my brother out of a business debt he never mentioned to anyone else. And through it all, I stayed silent, letting them believe I was getting by running some small tech startup. I figured one day when I'd proven myself beyond any doubt, they'd see me differently. That night was supposed to be that day. Instead, it turned into a public humiliation I'll never forget. The dinner had been loud and full of chatter, my siblings trading stories about their careers, my father reminiscing about his decades at the steel plant before he moved into management. My own work didn't come up as usual, but when dessert was served, I cleared my throat and told them the truth. I spoke about the company's growth, our contracts with Fortune 500 clients, and the valuation we'd just hit. I also presented a fully funded retirement portfolio I'd set up for my parents, a gift that would ensure they'd never have to worry about money again. The room went still. My father looked down at the papers, then up at me with an expression that didn't match the pride I'd imagined. His voice cut through the silence. "What is this? Some charity stunt? You think this makes you better than us?" I tried to explain that it wasn't about showing off, it was about gratitude, but the dam had already broken. My brother muttered about handouts, my sister rolled her eyes, and then my father, red-faced and shaking, told me to get out of his house. "Your money doesn't buy you class," he said. "You're still nothing but garbage in a suit." I can still feel the way my chest tightened, how my hands shook under the table. I stood pushing my chair back slowly, trying to keep what was left of my dignity intact. No one stopped me. No one called after me as I walked to the door. That drive back to my hotel felt longer than the entire flight from San Francisco. Streetlights blurred through my windshield, and every mile widened the gap between me and the people I'd spent my life trying to please. In that moment, one truth settled in my bones. I had built something remarkable, but in my father's eyes, I'd never be more than the boy who didn't follow the path he wanted. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the catalyst for a journey far bigger than business success. It was the beginning of reclaiming my freedom, not just financial, but the freedom to decide whose voices I let shape my life. And before I take you deeper into what happened next, I'd love to know, have you ever been underestimated by the very people who should have believed in you? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you want to hear how this night set off a chain of events that changed my life forever, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest, because this was only the beginning. I grew up in a neighborhood where life followed a simple formula: graduate high school, go to college, get a respectable job, and work it until retirement. My father, Henry Bennett, was the poster child for this path, 35 years in the same steel manufacturing firm, rising from the shop floor to a mid-level manager's office. My mother, Linda, taught at the same elementary school for decades, quietly reinforcing the idea that stability mattered more than passion. From as early as I can remember, I knew I didn't fit into that mold. While my older brother, Ethan, joined every academic club that would polish his college resume, and my sister, Megan, volunteered for all the right extracurriculars, I was in our garage experimenting with makeshift drone parts I'd ordered online. I loved solving problems, building things that didn't exist, before figuring out how moving parts fit together. My father didn't see innovation, he saw distraction. "Lucas needs to focus on his grades," he'd say over dinner. "All these little projects won't pay the bills when he's grown." My siblings nodded along, never missing a chance to remind me they were on the real track to success. It wasn't just about school. At 14, I ran a small neighborhood service fixing bikes and tuning up lawnmowers for $20 a job. By 16, I was repairing old gaming consoles and flipping them online for triple what I'd paid. I thought my parents would be proud that I was making my own money. Instead, Dad called it side hustle nonsense and warned me it would lead nowhere. Still, I tried to bridge the gap between who I was and what they wanted. I joined the robotics club in high school, hoping it might look legitimate to them. But even then, their praise was tepid compared to what my brother got for winning debate tournaments, or my sister for her straight A report cards. College was never my dream, but it was non-negotiable in their eyes. When I graduated high school, I enrolled at a local university's mechanical engineering program. The first semester felt like wearing a suit 3 sizes too small. Everything about it restricted me. Classes moved at a pace that felt like molasses, and half my professors had never worked outside academia. Meanwhile, my friends in the startup scene were building apps, launching Kickstarter campaigns, and actually putting things into the world. I'd sit in lecture halls thinking I could be doing that right now. But I pushed the thought aside, not ready to face my father's reaction if I quit. Then came the summer after freshman year. I took an internship at a small logistics startup in the city, just 5 people in a cramped office above a bakery, but they were solving real problems for real clients. I loved every second of it, the brainstorming sessions, the late nights debugging code, the thrill of seeing an idea go from sketch to functioning product. When the fall semester started, I went back to class like I was walking into a prison yard. By mid-October, I'd made my decision. I told my parents I was leaving school to work at the startup full-time. It was the loudest argument we'd ever had. My father's voice boomed through the kitchen. No child of mine is going to throw his life away chasing some internet fantasy. You think you're smarter than people with degrees? You'll end up broke, begging for work from the people who did it the right way. My mother cried quietly at the sink. But for me, the choice was clear. I wanted to build something meaningful. I wanted to own my time, my future. Even if it meant losing their approval, I couldn't ignore the pull toward creating rather than conforming. I left that night with 2 duffel bags and $1,800 in my checking account. My apartment was a tiny one-room walk-up with a mattress on the floor and a second-hand desk crammed against the wall. But when I set up my laptop and opened my project files, I felt freer than I'd ever been. The funny thing is, I thought the hardest part would be surviving on my own. I had no idea the bigger challenge would be carrying that invisible weight, knowing the people I loved most didn't believe in me. And as you'll see, that disbelief would shadow me for years, even as I began to prove them wrong. Before we move forward, I want to hear from you. Have you ever taken a leap your family didn't understand? Share it in the comments. And if you're just joining this journey, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how those first shaky steps set the stage for everything that came next. I lasted exactly 1 year at that cramped apartment before making my first big move and my first big series of mistakes. Working at the logistics startup was exhilarating, but it also planted a seed in my mind. If I can help build someone else's vision, why can't I build my own? By my second year out of college, I decided to take the leap into starting my own business. I had saved just under $5,000 from my job, barely enough to cover 3 months of living expenses, and I poured almost all of it into a concept I thought would take off immediately, a subscription-based courier service for small businesses in the city. On paper, it made sense. Plenty of shops needed quick, reliable delivery that didn't cost an arm and a leg. But paper doesn't factor in the weather, the chaos of managing drivers, or the reality that not every boutique bookstore or cupcake shop pays their invoices on time. Within 4 months, I was burning through cash faster than I could replace it. I ended up selling my bike fleet at a loss just to cover my rent. My second attempt wasn't much better. I thought I could pivot into building a mobile app for coordinating deliveries, a way for businesses and drivers to match in real time. I partnered with a freelance developer overseas to save money, but communication issues and time zone differences slowed progress to a crawl. By the time we had a working beta, a larger competitor had already dominated the market. That project died before it even had a chance to live. The third failure was the most painful because it was personal. I tried launching a line of custom-made tech backpacks with built-in charging ports using a small manufacturer I'd met at a trade show. The idea was solid and the prototypes were sleek. But I'd underestimated production timelines, and by the time the inventory arrived, the back-to-school season was over. I had stacks of unsold bags in my living room and a credit card bill that made me nauseous to open. Each time I stumbled, I heard my father's voice in my head. This is why people go to college. This is why they get real jobs, and each time it cut a little deeper. I didn't tell him or anyone in my family about the failures. As far as they knew, I was just keeping busy with my little projects. But failure, as brutal as it was, became my greatest teacher. The courier service taught me about operational logistics and the importance of vetting clients. The app debacle taught me to work only with partners I could communicate with directly and consistently. The backpack fiasco that was a masterclass in timing and market readiness. The turning point came during a late-night networking event at a co-working space. I was tired, broke, and 1 week away from giving up and finding a real job just to dig myself out of debt. That's when I met Martin Cole, a silver-haired entrepreneur who'd built and sold 3 companies in the manufacturing tech space. We ended up talking for hours. He didn't flinch when I told him I had no degree. Instead, he said, "Good. You've been learning in the real world where it actually counts." Martin became my mentor. He didn't sugarcoat anything. If an idea was bad, he told me outright. If I was overcomplicating a plan, he'd make me strip it down to its essentials. Under his guidance, I began focusing not on flashy ideas, but on real measurable problems that needed solving. One night over coffee, he gave me a challenge. Find a way to connect small American manufacturers with buyers who value local high-quality goods. Skip the middlemen. Make it easy for them to compete in a globalized market. That single challenge planted the seed for what would become my breakthrough. But at the time, all I had was a vague concept and a mentor who believed in me more than my own family did. Looking back, those early failures didn't just toughen me up, they stripped away my fear of trying again. When you've fallen flat on your face 3 times in a row, the worst thing that can happen already has. And that's oddly liberating. If you've ever failed at something and thought about quitting for good, I want you to pause right now and think, what did that failure actually teach you? Drop your answer in the comments. Someone else might need to hear it today. Because the truth is, those bruises I earned in my early 20s became the armor I'd need for the battle ahead. And the next chapter. That's where everything began to change. Martin's challenge rattled around in my head for weeks. Connect small American manufacturers directly to buyers. It sounded simple, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how massive the potential was and how badly this gap needed filling. I started small. My first step was visiting local manufacturing plants, from small woodworking shops in Pennsylvania to family-run metal fabrication warehouses in Ohio. I expected most owners to be skeptical, maybe even dismissive of some young guy with no degree promising to help their business. Instead, I found people hungry for opportunity. They were tired of losing contracts to overseas factories, tired of watching their craftsmanship undervalued in a race to the bottom on price. One of my first meetings was with a couple in their late 50s who made custom steel hardware. Their business had been in the family for 3 generations, but orders were drying up. The husband leaned across the table and said, "If you can find us buyers who care about quality over cost, you'll save more than our business, you'll save our legacy." That line stuck with me. With Martin's guidance, I sketched out a basic business model and e-commerce platform that acted as a digital marketplace exclusively for US-based manufacturers. No middlemen, no undercutting by overseas suppliers. The buyers would be businesses and consumers who valued authenticity, quality, and supporting local jobs. I spent my mornings cold calling potential partners and my afternoons learning how to build a functional website from scratch. I wasn't a coder, but I devoured online tutorials and pieced it together one late night at a time. My apartment looked more like a warehouse than a home. Boxes of product samples stacked against the walls, a secondhand printer jammed between my desk and the bed. In the beginning, it was slow going. I convinced 12 manufacturers to sign on in the first 2 months. It wasn't much, but it was enough to launch a basic version of the site. We went live with grainy product photos, clunky navigation, and zero marketing budget. Still, orders trickled in, mostly from friends of friends who'd heard about it through word of mouth. Then in the 3rd month, something happened that shifted everything. A mid-tier lifestyle blogger stumbled across the site and featured one of our woodworkers' handmade cutting boards in a holiday gift guide. Within 24 hours, the post went viral. My inbox exploded with order confirmations, supplier inquiries, and customer questions. I didn't sleep for 72 hours straight, juggling shipping logistics and upgrading the site to handle the surge in traffic. That single feature brought in nearly $15,000 in sales. For the first time, I saw the vision not just as a hopeful experiment, but as a viable, scalable business. I called Martin and told him the numbers. He chuckled and said, "Good. Now the real work begins." Of course not. Everyone shared the excitement. When I mentioned it to my parents during a Sunday phone call, my father responded with, "That's nice, but you know these internet things never last. You should still consider finishing your degree while you're young enough to do it. I bit my tongue just as I always did. What I didn't tell them was that I'd already mapped out the next phase, expanding beyond Pennsylvania and Ohio, onboarding artisans from all 50 states. I wanted furniture makers in Montana, leather crafters in Texas, glassblowers in Vermont. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There were server upgrades to plan, commission structures to refine, and a mountain of customer service emails to manage. But for the first time, I felt like I was building something that mattered, not just to me, but to hundreds of small business owners across the country. And deep down, I carried a quiet hope that maybe this would be the thing that finally made my family see me differently. I didn't realize it then, but that hope would prove far heavier than I could bear. If you've ever had a dream that others couldn't or wouldn't see, I want you to share it in the comments. You never know who might be waiting to hear that it's possible. Because as I was about to learn, success doesn't just test your skills. It tests your relationships in ways you can't predict. By the end of the first year, the platform, now officially named American Foundry Market, had grown from a dozen suppliers to over 60. I was onboarding new manufacturers every week, sometimes meeting them in dusty workshops where the scent of sawdust or machine oil clung to the air. Each partnership felt personal, like adding another brick to a foundation I was determined to make unshakable. But growth came with new problems. Our basic website infrastructure was straining under the weight of increased traffic. Customers were complaining about slow load times, and suppliers were frustrated when orders lagged in processing. I hired my first part-time developer, a wiry guy named Nate, who worked out of his garage and drank more energy drinks than water. Together, we rewrote the back-end code while I fielded customer emails from my kitchen table. Finances were another beast. I'd reinvested nearly every dollar back into the business, which meant I was still living in the same cramped apartment with thrift store furniture and a mattress on the floor. There were nights I'd eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner while negotiating 5-figure contracts over Zoom. The contrast was almost absurd. I tried cautiously to share some of this progress with my family. One Sunday, I called my mom and mentioned we'd passed $250,000 in gross sales for the quarter. There was a pause before she said, "That's nice, dear. But remember, these things can disappear overnight." The implication was clear stability meant a degree, a desk job, and a 401k zao. Anything else was playing with fire. Her words stung, but they didn't surprise me. I'd learned long ago not to expect enthusiasm from them when it came to my work. Still, I couldn't help hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, even if it was just a simple, "We're proud of you." That's when Martin's advice started echoing in my mind. Build for yourself, not for their approval. He was right, but it was easier said than done. No matter how many orders came in or how many manufacturers we helped, there was always that voice in the back of my head, my father's voice, reminding me that in their eyes, I was still the kid who didn't finish school. One evening, as I was boxing up a shipment of Vermont-made glassware to send to a boutique in Chicago, I caught myself imagining their reactions if they could see the operation I'd built. Would they finally understand? Or would they still dismiss it as just an online thing? That's when I realized something important. Maybe their validation wasn't the point anymore. Maybe the point was proving to myself that I could take an idea from nothing to something that changed lives, not just mine, but the lives of every small business owner who'd taken a leap of faith to join my platform. Still, the personal cost was adding up. I hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. I was working 16-hour days, and my social life was non-existent. Friends would invite me out, and I'd decline, telling myself I'd join next time. There was never a next time. My world had shrunk to my apartment, my laptop, and a network of manufacturers scattered across the country. It was in one of those late-night work sessions, empty coffee cup beside me, spreadsheets glowing on the screen, that I realized how much I wanted to hear from others who'd been through the same grind. Have you ever thrown yourself so completely into something that the rest of your life faded into the background? What did you gain and what did you lose? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes hearing from people who've been there is the reminder we need that we're not alone. As it turned out, I wasn't just building a company. I was building a test of endurance, one that would push me to my limits, and soon far beyond them. The next phase of growth would come fast, and it would change everything. By the start of year 3, American Foundry Market had transformed from a scrappy experiment into a full-fledged operation. We'd crossed over 200 partner manufacturers spread across 30 states. Our product catalog now ranged from hand-forged kitchen knives in Montana to artisanal leather belts in Texas, and customers were starting to recognize our brand name. But with scale came stress, the kind that doesn't just keep you awake at night, it follows you through every waking moment. Orders would spike unexpectedly after a magazine feature, and I'd find myself juggling supplier shortages, delayed shipments, and customer complaints all at once. The servers crashed twice that spring each time during major promotional events. I spent entire weekends on the phone with hosting companies praying the downtime wouldn't tank our reputation. To keep up, I took a gamble and leased a small office downtown. It wasn't much, barely 200 square feet, but it gave me space to bring on 2 full-time employees for customer service and vendor relations. Watching them work from real desks instead of my kitchen table felt like progress, even if I was still eating instant noodles for dinner. I didn't tell my parents about the office. Not because I was hiding it, but because the thought of hearing, well, we'll see how long it lasts, was exhausting. Still, some part of me wanted to pick up the phone to tell them I'd just signed a year-long lease because I believed in what I was building. It was around this time that I started noticing a shift in myself. I was no longer just running the day-to-day. I was thinking, strategically planning for growth, imagining what the business could be in 5 years. Martin saw it too. "You're not just an operator anymore," he told me one afternoon. "You're becoming a leader. Don't waste energy convincing the wrong people to see it." But leadership came with loneliness. My friends from high school were getting married, buying houses, starting families. My life revolved around supplier contracts and web analytics. I missed birthdays, skipped holidays, and found myself dodging invitations because I couldn't afford the mental space to be anywhere but in my business. I remember one Friday night in particular. I was sitting alone in the office at 11 p.m., surrounded by stacks of shipping boxes. Outside, I could hear the muffled sounds of people laughing as they headed to the bars down the street. I wondered if I was making a huge mistake pouring everything into a company that, for all its progress, might still collapse under a bad quarter. That doubt was the worst part. It crept in when I was most tired, whispering that my father might be right, that without a degree I was just playing in a sandbox that real business people didn't take seriously. But then I'd open my email and find a message from a manufacturer telling me that our platform had saved their business, or a customer thanking us for helping them buy local. Those moments pulled me back from the edge. I started thinking more about the sacrifices I was making and whether they were worth it. And here's where I'd like to turn the question to you. If you had to give up nearly every personal milestone for a dream that might still fail, would you do it? Or is there a line where the cost becomes too high? Let me know in the comments, because I'm curious how others measure that trade-off. For me, the answer at least then was yes. I'd keep going, I'd keep betting on myself, because the alternative was going back to a life where I felt like a passenger in someone else's car. What I didn't realize was that the road ahead was about to throw me into the kind of storm that makes or breaks everything. And when it hit, I'd have to decide whether to fight harder than ever or walk away for good. By the time the 4th year rolled around, American Foundry Market had blown past milestones I once thought were distant dreams. We'd hit over 400 partner manufacturers, shipping to customers in every state. The company's annual revenue had crossed into 7 figures, and for the first time in my life, I could look at my bank account without a knot forming in my stomach. But despite all of this, there was a quiet, stubborn ache I couldn't ignore. My family still had no idea how far I'd come. In their minds, I was still running that little online thing. The truth, the full scope of what I'd built, remained locked away. It wasn't just pride pushing me to finally speak up. It was the feeling that I'd been living in 2 separate worlds, one where I was leading a growing, respected company, and another where I was the underachieving son who'd taken a wrong turn. That split was exhausting. So when my father's 70th birthday was coming up, I made a decision. I was going to bridge that gap. I'd tell them everything about our valuation, the scale of our operations, the people we'd helped, and I'd back it up with a gift that wasn't just generous, but transformative. Martin wasn't convinced. Over lunch one day, he said, "Lucas, you don't owe them proof. Your work speaks for itself." But I shook my head. Maybe, but I need them to see it. I need them to know I didn't waste my life. I started planning weeks in advance. I purchased a fully funded retirement portfolio for my parents, a safety net that would ensure they'd never have to worry about money again. I had the documentation printed bound neatly in a leather folder. My idea was simple. I'd tell them about the business, then hand over the folder as both a gesture of gratitude and a bridge toward reconciliation. I rehearsed what I'd say. I'd start with the story, how the idea began, the risks I took, the struggles I faced. I'd talk about the manufacturers we'd saved from closing, the jobs we'd helped protect, the customers who'd found value in buying American made. I wanted them to see not just the numbers, but the mission behind them. And yes, part of me imagined their reactions. I pictured my father's eyes softening with pride, my mother smiling with relief. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment where the old narrative, the dropout, the disappointment would be replaced with something new. As the day approached, I felt a nervous excitement building. This wasn't just about sharing good news. It was about finally stepping fully into who I'd become without shrinking to fit their expectations. The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk in the office staring at the folder, running through my speech over and over in my head. I wasn't naive enough to think this would solve every issue between us, but I believed it could be a start. Looking back, I can see how much weight I put on that single evening. I was gambling years of unspoken frustration, sacrifice, and silent achievement on the hope that a heartfelt confession and a tangible gift could rewrite the story my family had about me. I had no idea that instead of healing the rift, I was walking straight into the fire. And before I tell you what happened when I finally put the truth on the table, I want to ask you, have you ever built up a moment in your mind, only to have it turn out completely differently? Share your story in the comments, because this next part of mine is proof that sometimes the reality is nothing like the fantasy. The night of my father's 70th birthday started like any other family gathering. Warm greetings at the door, the smell of roast beef drifting from the kitchen, the faint clink of wine glasses. My parents' house hadn't changed in decades, the same floral couch, the same framed family photos, the same heavy drapes that shut out most of the evening light. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, and in a way that was part of the problem. Dinner began with small talk. Ethan, my brother, went on about a promotion at his finance job. Megan, my sister, shared updates on her kids' soccer games and her new car. I waited patiently, the leather folder resting in my lap under the table, my mind rehearsing the speech I'd practiced 100 times. When dessert arrived, a triple-layer chocolate cake, my mother placed it in front of my father, candles flickering. After the obligatory song and cheers, I took a deep breath. "Dad, Mom, there's something I've been wanting to share with you for a long time." They both looked at me, my father still holding the cake knife. "Go ahead," he said almost absently. I started with the story how American Foundry Market began, the risks I'd taken, the challenges we'd overcome. I told them about the 400-plus manufacturers we'd partnered with, the millions in revenue, the jobs we'd helped save. I could see my mother's fork pause halfway to her mouth, my siblings exchanging quick glances. Then I opened the folder and slid it toward my father. "This," I said, "is a fully funded retirement portfolio. You'll never have to worry about money again." For a moment, silence hung heavy over the table. I braced for pride, for relief, anything but what came next. My father's expression hardened. "What is this supposed to be, Charity?" His voice was low, but the edge in it could have cut glass. "No," I said carefully. "It's gratitude. For everything you—" "Don't," he snapped, pushing the folder away. "We didn't raise you to throw money around like you're better than us." Ethan leaned forward. "Wait, are you saying you paid for Mom's surgery? My house, Megan's wedding?" The air seemed to crackle. My mother blinked in confusion, Megan's face flushed. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yes," I admitted. "I just wanted to help." "Help?" Ethan barked out a humorless laugh. "You mean make us charity cases?" It wasn't like that I insisted. My father slammed his palm on the table. "You drop out of college, disappear into your little online world, and now you show up throwing money around, thinking it makes you someone. You're still just garbage in a suit, and don't think a few dollars changes that." The words hit harder than I expected. I scanned their faces, searching for even one ally. My mother looked down at her plate. Megan bit her lip, eyes darting away. Ethan smirked, almost enjoying the moment. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Happy birthday, Dad?" I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. No one stopped me as I walked out. The cold night air outside was sharp against my skin, but it felt cleaner than the air I'd just left behind. I sat in my car for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process how years of sacrifice, of silent giving, had led to this rejection, resentment, and words I knew I'd never be able to unhear. That drive back to my hotel felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Something in me had shifted permanently. The boy who still hoped for their approval was gone. Have you ever been blindsided by the people you thought would always have your back? Tell me in the comments, because the next step I took after that night changed everything about how I live my life. I didn't sleep that night. The hotel room felt sterile and foreign, its beige walls and faint smell of industrial cleaner amplifying the emptiness I felt inside. I sat at the desk with my laptop open, not to work, but to make a list every cent I'd ever given my family. It wasn't about keeping score. It was about facing reality. There it was in black and white, $82,000 for mom's surgery paid directly to the hospital. $110,000 for Ethan's down payment, plus another $15,000 months later for renovations he couldn't quite afford. $45,000 to cover the shortfall for Megan's wedding when her fiancé lost his job. Smaller amounts dotted the list, like aftershocks, dad's car repair, mom's kitchen remodel, holiday gifts, emergencies. Nearly $300,000 in total. Money I never expected back. And yet somehow it had all been twisted into an insult. Around 2 a.m., I drafted a letter. It wasn't an angry tirade, but it was honest, maybe more honest than I'd ever been with them. Dad, Mom, I've spent years trying to earn your respect while hiding my success so you wouldn't feel uncomfortable. I've supported our family financially because I love you, not to shame you. But after last night, I see that no amount of giving will ever change how you see me. I cannot keep subjecting myself to the same disrespect, especially when it targets the very things I've worked hardest to achieve. I will always love you, but for my own well-being, I need to step back. I printed the letter the next morning, sealed it in an envelope, and dropped it in the mail before my flight back to San Francisco. The days that followed were quiet. No calls, no texts, except one from Megan a week later. We all said things we didn't mean. Maybe you should come for Thanksgiving. I didn't reply. The truth was they had meant it, at least enough to say it without hesitation. I threw myself into work, but my focus wasn't the same. Every contract signed, every positive review from a manufacturer was a reminder of the people who'd never see it for what it was. That's when I decided I needed a clean break, not just emotionally, but physically. For the past year, I'd been renting out a coastal house I'd bought as an investment property in Mendocino County. It was secluded, perched on a bluff with panoramic views of the Pacific. I'd always imagined it as a getaway spot for weekends. Now I realized it could be my permanent home. Within 2 weeks, I'd given notice on my San Francisco lease, hired movers, and arranged for the bulk of my furniture to be donated. I packed only what I needed: clothes, personal mementos, and my work setup. The first night in that house, I slept with the windows open, letting the sound of the waves fill the space. There was a peace in that isolation, a sharp contrast to the heaviness I'd been carrying. It wasn't about running away. It was about reclaiming space for myself, both physically and mentally. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to check my phone every time it buzzed, just in case it was a family member. My mornings were mine again. My work was mine again. My life was mine again. And I have to ask, have you ever reached a point where walking away felt like the only way forward? Share it below, because the next phase of my journey was about to show me what life can look like when you stop chasing the wrong approval. Moving to the Mendocino coast felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The first few mornings, I'd wake up to sunlight streaming through the wide ocean-facing windows, the air crisp with salt and pine. Instead of the relentless noise of the city, I had the steady rhythm of waves and the occasional call of a gull. At first, I thought the quiet might make me restless, but it didn't. It healed me. My days started with long walks along the cliffside trails my phone left at home. The early fog would roll in, wrapping the coastline in a soft gray, and I'd feel a kind of groundedness I'd never known before. Work didn't stop. If anything, the distance made me more intentional about it. I restructured my schedule so I could handle high-level decision-making in the mornings, then take afternoons for deep work without constant Slack pings. Nate handled most of the tech team's questions now, and our vendor relations manager had grown into the role with confidence. I wasn't micromanaging anymore, and that shift gave me space to think bigger. I started plotting an expansion into B2B contracts, selling directly to restaurants, hotels, and corporate offices that wanted American-made products in bulk. It was the kind of move that could double our revenue in 2 years. But for the first time, I wasn't driven by the desire to prove something to anyone. I was building because I believed in it. The emotional weight I'd been carrying for so long was lighter, too. There were moments when I'd think about my family Thanksgiving dinner's birthday calls, but the sting was duller. I'd stopped replaying the birthday scene in my head every night. Now I could remember it without feeling like my chest was caving in. One Friday, I invited Martin up to see the house. He stood on the deck with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the endless blue. "You did good, Lucas," he said. "You built something that lets you choose where and how you live. That's more freedom than most people ever get." I knew he was right. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents had raised me to believe security was the highest goal, and yet here I was more secure than ever precisely because I'd ignored their version of the path. One evening, sitting by the fire pit with a glass of wine, I caught myself thinking about the younger version of me, the one who'd been desperate for his father's approval. I wished I could tell him what I knew now, that the people who can't see your worth when you're struggling might not be able to see it when you're thriving either. And that's not your fault. I started writing more journal entries, notes to myself, even a draft of what might become a memoir someday. Not for publishing, at least not yet, but as a way to map the road I'd traveled. And to anyone listening now, I'd ask, what would you build if you stopped trying to prove yourself to someone else? What would your life look like if you made decisions based only on what mattered to you? Tell me in the comments, your answer might surprise you. I didn't know it yet, but my decision to live life on my own terms was about to face its first real test. Because just when I thought I'd closed the chapter on my family, a letter arrived in the mail, and it would force me to decide if I was truly ready to stand by the boundaries I'd set. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into my coastal mailbox between a grocery store flyer and a utility bill. I almost tossed it onto the kitchen counter without looking until I saw the handwriting. My mother's. It wasn't a card not thick enough for that. Just a single sheet of paper inside. My stomach tightened as I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded it. "Lucas, your father's health has been declining. He won't admit it, but I can see it. He has trouble walking up the stairs and his doctor wants to run more tests. We don't know what's coming. He talks less these days. Sometimes he sits in his chair for hours without saying a word. I think he's scared, though he'd never tell you that. I'm writing because I believe time is shorter than we think. I know things were said that night, things that can't be unsaid. But maybe there's still time to mend what's broken." She signed it simply, "Love, Mom." I read it twice, then a third time. My first instinct was anger that the same man who had cut me down so brutally might now need my compassion. Anger that my mother's first real outreach since that night was tied to his decline. But beneath the anger was something else. A low, steady ache. The kind that comes when you realize the people you've been trying to distance yourself from are still unavoidably part of your story. I didn't respond right away. For days, I carried the letter in my pocket, touching the folded paper absent-mindedly while I worked. Some part of me hoped the decision whether to go back even for a visit would make itself. It didn't. I took long walks on the bluff, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with my father. The grudging praise, the backhanded comments, the years of silence followed by bursts of criticism. I thought about that night at his 70th birthday, the look in his eyes when he called me garbage in a suit. And I thought about the kid I'd once been, desperately wanting him to see me. Martin noticed something was off. Over dinner one night, he said, "You're quieter than usual. Something's up." I told him about the letter. He leaned back, studying me. "You don't owe him forgiveness, but you might owe yourself closure. Just make sure you know which one you're after." That night I lay awake thinking about his words. Forgiveness felt impossible, at least the kind that rewrites history. But closure, maybe. Closure didn't require pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It just meant deciding how I wanted this chapter to end. By the end of the week, I'd made up my mind. I'd go. Not to prove anything, not to mend their opinion of me, but to face him one last time on my terms. And before I tell you what happened when I walked back into that house, I want to know, have you ever gone back to face someone who deeply hurt you, not for them but for yourself? Share it below. Because the next part of my story isn't about reconciliation. It's about finding out just how much you've changed when you stand in the same room you once ran from. I arrived at my parents' house on a gray Saturday afternoon. The sky hung low with heavy clouds, and the air had that damp chill that seeps into your bones. It felt fitting somehow, like the weather had agreed to set the mood for what I was walking into. When my mother opened the door, she looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched and her hair thinner. She didn't hug me right away, just gave me a tight, searching smile before stepping aside. Inside the house smelled the same roast chicken lemon cleaner and a faint trace of old books. My father was in his recliner, a blanket over his legs. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment neither of us said a word. "Lucas," he finally said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Dad," I replied, taking the chair across from him. We sat in a silence that wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, the clink of dishes breaking the stillness. "How have you been?" he asked, eyes fixed on the muted TV. "Good," I said. "Business is strong. I moved up the coast." He nodded slowly, his gaze never quite meeting mine. "Heard you've done well." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no bite, just a statement, and somehow that made it harder to know what to say next. I told him a little about life in Mendocino, the ocean views, the quiet mornings, the new business contracts. He listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing at me like he was measuring the truth in my words. After a while, my mother brought in tea. "You two should talk," she said softly, retreating to the other room. I leaned forward. "Dad, I'm not here to fight about the past. I need to be clear about where I stand. What you said that night on your birthday, it cut deep. And I can't go back to pretending like it didn't happen." He shifted in his chair, wincing a little, whether from his legs or from my words, I couldn't tell. "I was wrong to say it like that," he admitted almost grudgingly. "But you have to understand, I didn't know what to make of what you were doing. It didn't fit into what I thought was secure, what I thought was right." "That's just it," I said. "Your version of secure wasn't mine, and I've spent years chasing your approval, trying to prove that my way could work. But I'm done chasing. I came here because I wanted you to hear that from me directly." He stared at me for a long moment. "You've changed," he said finally. "I had to," I replied. The clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Outside, rain began to patter against the window. We didn't hug. We didn't hash out every detail of the last decade. But there was a shift, small, almost imperceptible. Like the ground between us had leveled just enough that we could stand on it without sliding back into old patterns. And here's where I'll pause to ask you, if you had the chance to sit across from someone who hurt you deeply, would you take it? Would you risk reopening old wounds for the possibility of walking away lighter? Tell me in the comments. Because what happened next, what my father chose to reveal, was something I never saw coming, and it would change how I understood my family's story forever. The rain had picked up, drumming steadily on the roof, when my father leaned back in his recliner and let out a long, tired breath. For a moment, I thought he was going to change the subject, maybe ask about the weather on the coast. Instead, he said something that made my pulse jump. "There's something you should know, Lucas. Something I should have told you years ago." I stayed quiet, sensing that whatever was coming wasn't easy for him to say. "When you were in high school, we almost lost the house. I'd made some bad investments. Stupid ones. I was too proud to admit it. Your mom didn't know the full extent either. The only reason we kept it was because your grandfather paid off the mortgage. But there was a condition, he told me. I had to keep you on a traditional path. College, stable job, none of this risky dream chasing." It took me a second to process. "So you weren't just disappointed when I dropped out. You thought you were breaking some kind of deal." He nodded. "I thought if I didn't push you toward the safe route, I'd be letting him down and proving to myself that I'd failed as a father. So when you chose differently, it scared the hell out of me. And I didn't know how to say that without it sounding like an attack." I sat back, feeling the old hurt shift into something more complicated. Anger was still there, but now it was tangled with a kind of stunned understanding. His cruelty hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from fear, from a sense of debt I never knew existed. "Why not tell me this before?" I asked. "Because," he said, his voice catching slightly, "I didn't want you to see me as weak, or worse, as a failure." It was strange realizing that the man who had seemed so unshakable all my life had been carrying his own secret shame. It didn't erase what he'd said to me that night, but it reframed it, and maybe in some small way, it softened the edges. We sat in silence again, but it was different this time. The room felt heavier, yes, but also truer. I thought about how many years I'd spent pushing for his approval, not knowing he'd been fighting a private battle to protect his own image. We'd both been defending something, his pride, my independence, and in the process, we'd been speaking completely different languages. Finally, I said, "You know, Dad, I can't change how we got here, but I think maybe I understand you better now, and that's something." He gave a faint nod, his eyes glistening in a way I wasn't used to seeing. That's all I can ask for. We didn't hug then either, but when I left that night, his "take care of yourself," son felt less like an obligation and more like a choice. Have you ever learned a truth that didn't erase the pain, but made you see the person differently? Share it with me, because the final step in this story isn't about fixing the past. It's about deciding what to carry forward and what to finally lay down. Driving back up the coast that night, the highway felt different, less like an escape route, and more like a path I'd chosen deliberately. The Pacific stretched dark and endless to my left, waves crashing against invisible cliffs. My father's words replayed in my head, not in a loop of anger this time, but as pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was missing. Understanding him didn't mean forgetting what he'd done. It didn't mean I suddenly wanted to slip back into the old family dynamic, pretending those years of judgment and cold distance had never happened. What it did mean was that I finally saw the full picture: two stubborn men, both trying to protect themselves in ways that looked like rejection to the other. When I reached my house, I stood on the deck for a long time, watching the white churn of waves below. I thought about the letter my mother had sent about the version of me that would have rushed back into the family fold the moment I heard health problems. That version would have twisted himself into knots over giving to prove his worth, only to be met with the same old walls. But that wasn't who I was anymore. The next morning I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm but tentative. "You came," she said softly. "I did," I replied. "And I'm glad I did. But Mom, I can't come back in the same way I used to. I can visit, I can talk, but I need to keep some space, because that's the only way I can stay healthy in this." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand," she said finally. "I just hope you know we love you." "I do," I said. "But love doesn't mean losing yourself. I think I'm only just learning that." After we hung up, I felt a calm I hadn't expected. Boundaries had always felt like rejection to me, like saying no meant I was shutting someone out forever. Now I realized boundaries were actually the opposite, the thing that allowed me to stay connected without drowning. In the weeks that followed, I kept my life in Mendocino steady. I worked on the B2B expansion. I hosted Martin for a weekend. I took long drives along the coast just because I could. My father called once, a short conversation about a fishing trip he'd taken years ago. We didn't talk about the birthday. We didn't talk about the mortgage deal with my grandfather. But the fact that he called at all felt like its own kind of progress. The truth is, I don't know how much time he has left. I don't know if we'll ever get to a place where we're trading stories easily without the weight of old battles in the room. But I do know that I've stopped living for that day. My worth isn't hanging on whether or not my father can see it, and that might be the biggest shift of all. What about you? Have you ever reached a point where you could care about someone without needing their approval? Let me know in the comments, because the final part of this story is about living fully in that freedom, and I can tell you it changes everything. Life in Mendocino settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I was craving. Mornings began with coffee on the deck, the Pacific stretching out like a living, breathing canvas. Some days the ocean was calm and silver under the sunrise. Others it roared and churned like it was warning me not to take its peace for granted. The business thrived. The B2B contracts started rolling in faster than I expected. Small boutique hotels ordering custom glassware, farm-to-table restaurants wanting locally made cutlery, even a few corporate offices looking for American-made furnishings. I was no longer just running a company. I was creating a network of people who believed in the same values I did. And the difference was, I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. Not my father's, not my family's, not even the industry's. The success felt cleaner this way, earned on my own terms, without the constant need to prove I belonged in the room. Every few weeks, I'd get a short call from my father. Sometimes it was about the weather, sometimes about a news story he'd seen. Once he even asked about the business, not with suspicion but curiosity. We still weren't close in the way most people think of fathers and sons, but the conversations were no longer battles. That shift was enough. It didn't have to be everything. One weekend, standing on the cliffside trail, with the wind cutting across my face, I realized something: my life was no longer defined by the people who couldn't see me. It was defined by what I chose to build. By the mornings I woke up without dread, by the relationships I nurtured because they gave as much as they took. I thought about that younger version of me, the one who sat at a birthday table folder in hand, desperate for a nod of approval that never came. I wanted to tell him, "You'll survive it. More than that, you'll grow into a life where their opinion doesn't hold the keys anymore." Now, when I look ahead, I see possibility. Expansion into new markets. Maybe writing that memoir for real. Hosting retreats for other entrepreneurs who've faced the same uphill battles, not just in business, but in family expectations. And if you've made it this far in my story, I want to leave you with this. You do not need everyone to understand your path for it to be valid. You can care about people without surrendering your own compass. If that's something you've struggled with, maybe it's time to ask yourself, whose approval are you chasing and what could your life look like without that weight? Because my next chapter, well, it's going to be about building something even bigger than my company, something that has nothing to do with my father at all. And if you're curious what that is, you're going to want to stick around because that's the story I'm telling next. Click over to my next video where I'll show you how walking away from the wrong battles can open doors you never even knew were there. There's a quiet that lives here on the coast, one that seeps into you if you let it. It's in the early mornings when the fog still clings to the cliffs, in the soft crash of waves against rock, in the way the gulls hang suspended in the wind, like they've decided there's nowhere else they need to be. When I first moved here, I thought the quiet might swallow me. I'd spent years running on noise meetings, calls, family dramas, the constant hum of trying to prove myself. But over time, the quiet didn't swallow me. It steadied me. It became the space where I could finally hear my own voice without it being drowned out. I still think about my family. There are days when I wish things had been easier, when I wish we'd found a way to speak the same language sooner. But I've learned that wishing doesn't change what's already been lived. What matters is what you do with what comes after. And here's what I've chosen. I will carry the parts of them that taught me strength, resilience, and persistence. I will leave behind the parts that told me I was only worthy if I fit into their mold. I will keep the love, but I will no longer trade my peace for it. If there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as simple as waking up in a place you chose, living a life you built, and knowing you don't owe your happiness to anyone else's approval. And that, I think, is a kind of wealth no one can take away.